To take a more detailed look at a site in Active Directory, a site represents a physical location represented by one or more IP networks. Let's say I am an international company, or I work for an international company. So I have an office in the US, and in the US, I have a domain controller. So I'll say that's DC1. I also have a large office in India, and I have several DCs in India. So I'll just say DC2. We'll just draw one, but we'll say there's several in each location. And I also have an office in Brazil, and I have a domain controller in Brazil, but we'll just say DC3. Well, this presents an interesting challenge. These domain controllers can all be members of the same domain. But what that means, if they are in the same domain, by default, they will replicate with each other. So when you create a new user, if I have a user Bob Ross, if I create that user on DC1, that user will replicate to DC2 in India, to DC3 in Brazil. You create a user in India, it's going to replicate to the US and to Brazil. They're going to be exact replicas of each other. The purpose of creating sites in Active Directory is to have some control over how replication works. So the reason I actually create sites, there are really two: replication and service localization. When I create a site, I would have a site named US would be its own site. Let's say everything in the US is on subnet 172.16.0.0. Everything in India is on 172.17.0.0. And in Brazil, 172.18.0.0. So those would be our subnets associated with each location. What I can now do, I can schedule when replication occurs between the US and my India domain controllers. Maybe I want that to be every 3 hours. Then I define that to replicate on that schedule. The service localization means whenever you connect to resources, you would always use local resources first. For example, if I have a user in India, let's say the IP address of their computer is 172.17.9.52. When you look at the IP address and see that it's 172.17, you know that computer is in India. All the addresses in the US start with 172.16. In Brazil, they all start with 172.18. So this means you have to be in the India location. So what happens when your user tries to authenticate? They will go out and ultimately locate a domain controller. And we'll see how that process works later, because that involves passing some queries to DNS. But what happens, it will always get referred to this domain controller first because they are in the same Active Directory site. Now, we know they're in the same site because they're on the same IP subnet. A pretty fascinating concept. So my user would always authenticate against this domain controller first. If that domain controller has crashed and is offline for some reason, only then would it communicate with a domain controller in Brazil or in the US. And likewise, domain controllers in the US would always service users in the US first. In Brazil, that domain controller would always service users in Brazil. The point of that is you don't unnecessarily cross a WAN link. That's the reason you would create these Active Directory sites. Now, how that relates to group policy. You can apply group policy at a site level. If I have some settings that I only want to apply to users in India, you could create a GPO and you could link it to your site in India. That is possible. It is not common because what you're saying is, I want you to get this setting truly because you are on this IP network. If you leave this IP network, I no longer want you to get that setting. That's just not common. Not a lot of configurations work that way. In the past, default printers would be the most common thing that were set that way. But we'll have better ways to do that now through group policy preferences versus these site level policies. Now, just to show you how the sites themselves would look and how this would be set up, I'm going to switch back to my domain controller. I'm back on RTS-DC1. What I'm going to do is go to Tools, and there is this Active Directory Sites and Services. That opened down here on my taskbar. Notice right now there's one site named Default First Site Name. I'm going to leave that just like it is. But what I'm going to do is right-click Sites, and I'm going to create 3 new sites. I'm going to name one US. Now this says add subnets for US to the subnets container. We'll come back and do that, but we'll get that message for our sites. Just a reminder that I have to associate these with subnets. I'm going to create a new site for India. And for Brazil. So we have our sites created. Now I just need to associate those with IP subnets. So I'm going to go to this subnets folder here, and I'm going to right-click New Subnet. And for the prefix, I'm going to use 172.16.0.0. Now, we do have to specify what we call this sitter notation in lieu of typing in a subnet mask because it does not accept that. I'm going to type /16. That is really in place of the subnet mask. That 16 means that the first 16 bits of the address identify the network you're actually on. Now, the first 16 bits of the address here would be 172.16. So whatever network you're on, you would be able to obtain exactly what this prefix is for the network. But that's what I'm using for the US. And I'll okay that. I said that India was 172.17. And we'll choose India. And we said Brazil was 172.18. What would happen now? I would be able to take a domain controller. So my RTS DC1. Let's say this is really in India. Then I could simply right-click and move out of the default site to the India site. Now it actually shows up here under my India site. Now we would assume the address on that would need to be 172.18. Forgive me, 172.17 is the subnet we associated with India. So what would happen now? Users in India would always be sent to a domain controller in the India site. Pretty fascinating. And if I right-click India and go to Properties, I can see that it is this 172.17.0.0/16 subnet. And you could add as many subnets as you want to a site. So let's say India had 4 subnets. You would simply go New Subnet, type in the prefix for that subnet, and you would just choose India again. So this just mirrors the layout of your IP topology for your environment. You simply do that here. Now, what this means to me, I'm actually going to move my domain controller back to the default site. Now that default first site name, it just exists. I didn't create it. It's just always present when you install Active Directory. But how these sites relate to group policy, there is this sites that shows up in group policy. Now this is how you know that sites are not very commonly used for group policy, because you can't even see your sites. What you have to do is actually right-click, Show Sites. Now you see Brazil, India, the US show up. You have to select those and OK, and only now could you go link a GPO to those sites. So they're not even visible by default. Now that's unimportant, the fact that they have no visibility by default, but it's kind of your sign. Microsoft thought that linking GPOs to a site is so uncommon, they don't even clutter the interface with the sites themselves. So it kind of tells you how common Microsoft thinks they will be used. But I'm going to go back to Show Sites, and I'm just going to clear all of those because I don't want to clutter the interface itself. And I'm going to navigate back to my sites, and I'm going to delete each of those sites. That's India deleted, and we'll delete Brazil. And I'm also going to do the same for the subnets. We don't need those cluttering up our interface there. Now we're just back to where we started. I do have a YouTube video that's about a 30-minute video that covers Active Directory sites in great detail for anyone that wants to do a deep dive on sites. The URL for that is under this lesson if you want to take a look at that on my YouTube channel.